Can I have Dr. Koushik Gowsami and R. Chandrasekar on stage, please? Dr. Koushik Gowsami is an English teacher at Malda College, West Bengal, was a humanities visiting scholar. Features in journals like World Literature Today, The Team's Review, Roopkatha Journal, Rising Asia, the Calcutta Journal of Global Affairs. His interest includes diaspora studies, Tibet and Nepalese, Anglophone literature, post-colonial studies and South Asian studies. Thank you, sir. Thank you for being here. And our moderator, R. Chandrasekar. R. Chandrasekar has been writing fiction for over 20 years. Several of his short stories have appeared in anthologies and 2 of his novels. The Goat and the Sofa, and Mr. Swami, and the School of Core Incompetence have been published by HT India. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabri. And Koushik, a very warm welcome to Chennai and a very warm welcome to our literature festival.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We all have an image of Tibet in our minds. And I suspect most of us have never been there. And the few of us who have been there probably have been to Kailash, Manasrovar, and not much else. But we have this picture of Tibet, and it's largely from what we've sort of seen, heard, and most importantly, read. So what Koushik has done in this book, which, as Shabari said, has been shortlisted for various awards, is to think about how people have written about Tibet. So Koushik, first of all, where did you get the idea about writing this particular book? And if you can tell us a little bit more about the ideas in the book.
So I never thought that I'd be able to write a book on Tibet. I started my journey as a researcher when I was a MPhil research scholar in the University of Bardhaman. I saw a book which was gifted to me by my supervisor, and the title of the book is Kora, and it is written by Tenzin Sundu, a Tibetan writer and activist. So this book creates a curiosity in my mind, and I started reading this book, and then I started doing further research on this particular area, and I found that this area is less explored in the discipline called diaspora studies, South Asian studies, Himalayan studies, and post-colonialist studies as well. So you know that as an outsider, it is really very difficult task to write about a community which is not your own. So I tried to get in touch with some Tibetan diasporic authors, and successfully this book contains 7 interviews of Tibetan diasporic writers and 1 interview of Indian diasporic writers who has written on Tibet. So my research finally gets the form of a book.
Thank you. So apart from the interviews, the sort of the meat of the book is an analysis of 3 novels about Tibet. One written by a European who probably knew nothing about Tibet, Lost Horizon, by James Hilton, which came out in 1932. The Mandala of Sherlock Holmes, written by Jamyang Nobu, who is Tibetan, which came out in 1999. And the third book by Koushik Barua, who's from Assam, called Wind Horse, which came out in 2013. And let's talk about Koushik Barua's book first. So he says that his introduction to Tibet was somewhat similar to yours. He goes to Dharamshala, he goes to a bookshop and picks up a book there about Tibet and finds it very interesting, goes back to the shop owner and says that, I find this very interesting, can you tell me something more about it? And then he discovers a lot more about the bookshop owner. Do you want to pick up on that?
Yes. As I told that it is really very difficult for an outsider, and I took interview of Koushik Barua, and he points out this the situation of an outsider, and he done his research very fruitfully, and he has presented realistically the Tibetan exilic situation in Tibet. And you know that how Tibet is stereotyped, essentialized, and generalized as Shangri-La or mythical Himalayan utopia or an exotic place. But in Koushik Borua's Windhorse, he tries to break all these false stereotypes, and he tries to present Tibetan exilic situation in Tibet and also in Dharamsala or in different parts of the world. So this novel is very crucial from Indian's perspective, and because his ways of representation, his ways of gazing at Tibet is both insider outsider's perspective, can be interpreted from both insider outsider perspective, because you know that India has a close religious and cultural links with Tibet and Himalaya. I would like to point out here, the Himalaya as a socio-cultural region has connected different nation states like Nepal, Bhutan, Tibet, and these areas, you know that there are several commonalities. And Koushik Borua's ideological standpoint and viewpoint is very crucial because he understands the Tibetan exilic situations, their consciousness, and he fictionalized all these situation and give its form of a novel.
So, I mean, Koushik Borua's book basically talks about an armed uprising by the Tibetans against the Chinese, which went from the 1950s to about the 1970s. And as I said, this is something he learned from this bookseller, and it turned out that the bookseller himself was involved in that armed struggle. So one of the characters in the book is basically based on that bookseller, a real-life bookseller in Dharamshala. And Koushik Borua, I think, did a lot of work. He spent years talking to Tibetans living in India, basically, because he couldn't go to Tibet, obviously.
Yes.
And so the characters in this book also, I mean, one is a Tibetan who's grown up in India, and one is a Tibetan who was born in Tibet and had to move to India. And he sets the whole story in this period of armed conflict between Tibetans and the Chinese. And it's clearly a very political book.
Yes.
In the sense, it's very sympathetic towards the Tibetan viewpoint. And he's taken very great pains to make sure that the characters are real, that they're based on sort of people he's actually talked to and met, the thoughts that the characters express in the novels and so on, like that. So the second book which you write about is The Mandala of Sherlock Holmes, came out in 1999. And why don't you tell us a bit about it? And how it compares. It's also a political book, I think, you know, but how does it compare to Koushik Borua's book?
Yes. So you know that Chinese invasion and occupation of Tibet in 1950s have compelled Tibetans to leave their homeland behind. So they still anticipate Tibet as their nation, and they dream of returning Tibet. And in Koushik Borua's Windhorse, you will get the picture of Tibetan armed resistance movements, and the setting of the novel is 1950 to 1970. But in the Mandala of Sherlock Holmes, you will get a different kinds of picture, because Norubu here introduces two Western characters, that is Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty, in a symbolical way. Because Holmes here represents a good forces, quote unquote, and Moriarty here represents the bad forces. And Moriarty here becomes an agent of Chinese embassy. Or you can say that Moriarty here encourages Chinese regime. So this novel mystifies, demystifies, and remystifies Tibet. So mystification, demystification, and demystification, all these three things work in this novel. Now the question comes in. Question can come in your mind that why the Western characters? Because you know that as Tibetans lack the armed, political and military lack the armed and political power, so they need the Western help to get their homeland back. So Holmes here represents such Western characters who does not stereotype Tibet or in a distorted way, but shows a kind of sympathy towards Tibetans. And he is helping here, or he represents a kind of power that can help Tibetan back the mandala, which Chinese wants to steal.
Yeah, so just to sort of put that in context, I mean, this book is set in the 1890s. And those of you who are familiar with Sherlock Holmes, he's supposed to have fallen off the Reichenbach Falls. There's a big public protest that they didn't want Sherlock Holmes to die, so he's brought back to life. And so what happened in between? So there's this fiction that he, disguised as a Norwegian traveler, went to Tibet. So this is about 1892 to 1894 or something like that. So again, the sort of the political background in the book is that there is a sort of a child Dalai Lama, and there's this Chinese regent from the Qing dynasty. So the Chinese regent is being supported by Moriarty, who's a bad guy, and the child Dalai Lama is being supported by Sherlock Holmes, who's a good guy. And as it turned out, in the novel, both Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty have a deep background because they grew up in Tibet, or they received in Tibetan religious training early in their lives. So there's a sort of, in some sense, shouldn't say the yin and the yang because those are Chinese words, right? And we shouldn't talk about China in the context of Tibet. But basically the good versus bad forces, and Sherlock Holmes being the good force. What is sort of interesting is, okay, the third book you talk about is, in contrast to the other two, written by a person who probably had zero background about Tibet. But he saw Tibet, this is James Hilton, Lost Horizon, and he's the one, I think, who coined the word Shangri-La as a sort of a mystical, exotic place which was all good. And it's kind of interesting that he set this sort of mystical place in the Tibetan plateau. So from a Western point of view, someone who knows nothing about Tibet, Tibet somehow stood for something good, even though he didn't know what it was. I think that's interesting.
Yes. James Hilton's Lost Horizon, if you read the novel, you'll see that there is a space, that is imaginary space, that is called Shangri-La. And the word Sang is a place of the district of Yusang, and La means mountain. So Shangri-La is a mythical place, and in James Hilton's Lost Horizon, it appears as a utopia, or a place where the people can enjoy the longevity, people can enjoy their wondrous youth, and they can stop time or stop age. So this novel mystifies Tibet and represents Tibet in a distorted way, but James Hilton here tactfully employs some other characters who counterattacks such misrepresentation. But all these things happen in a stereotypical way, because Shangri-La as a space no longer exists. But now I would like to point out here that if you visit some places in Dharamsala or Sikkim or in Himalayan region, you will find that there are many hotels whose name is Shangri-La, where you get some utopia pleasure. But this is something that where we mythify some particular place. So here you see the mystification of Tibet, and this novel is represented from outsider perspective, and the politics of representation here is very crucial, because how Hilton as an outsider mythifies Tibet, that is important.
And I think what is sort of interesting is he mythifies Tibet, but all the main characters in the book are Europeans.
Yes.
The head Lama in the book turns out to be a European. There's this Chinese lady in the book who's supposed to have learned piano from Chopin. So all the manifestations of culture in this monastery in Tibet are Europeans. The Tibetans themselves have no agency in the book. They're just there.
That is very interesting because you know that it was very, you can say that James Hilton as an Western represents a kind of picture which will be, represents a place where the Western characters can live their life very warmly. So he creates such a space of Shangri-La, an imaginary space, and the Lama, the two Lamas are there, and they are from the West. It means that West can only rule, and the Eastern people is not, they don't have the capability to rule someone. So the Lamasari is ruled by a Lama who is from the West, and the Lama is looking for another one, that is Hukonoe.
And he's looking for another Westerner to succeed.
So that is from the West. So, and from that particular perspective, we can see, and many research questions can come in your mind, why not Eastern, why not there is any Eastern characters?
So Koushik, I mean, as you sort of said when you started out, you have spoken to a number of Tibetan writers and activists. And I think their mission is to sort of help people better understand what Tibet actually is. I mean, who the Tibetan people are, what their culture is, and so on and so forth. And I think they've been sort of fairly actively, they've been active in writing, they've been active in social media, in trying to sort of correct people's perception of what Tibet is. And this is an area you've been working on. So do you want to sort of tell us something more about that?
Yes, and that is interesting because Tibetan diasporic Anglophone literature, as I told, that has not been much addressed. So there are some emerging Tibetan writers who have written who had written some literary works on Tibet, and writing here plays an important role because it expresses their conflict between homeland and the host land, and they represent their exilic situations, their exilic consciousness. And the most important thing I would like to point out here is the Tibet Rights Publishing House in Dharamsala. They play an important role because they are publishing many literary works. They have started translating some literary works, and last year I visited Tibet Policy Institute. They invited me to deliver a talk, and I saw that there are thousands of manuscripts which is originally written in Tibetan language. So they are trying to find out some good translator who will be able to translate the literary text, and there are some writers like Tenzin Sundu, Bujungdi Sonam, Sering Wangmo Dhompa, Thupten Sample, and all these writers have written excellent books on Tibetan memory, because memory here plays an important role. Because if you don't convert your memory into stories, then your memory will be lost. And Tenzin Sundu plays an important role here because he's a writer and activist, and I would like to quote his line that he says, when I write, I'm a poet, and when I publish it, I'm an activist. So, and I would also like to point out one poem that is written by Mamta Kalia, and she says that, I write because I cannot bite. It is the way the weak ones fight. So writing here becomes the medium of expressing your thoughts, your ideas, and Tibetans are fighting for their homeland, and they are addressing their situations in Tibet and also in their exilic world.
So one last question for you, Koushik, and then maybe a couple of questions from the audience at this time. What are you working on next? What's your next project? What's your next book?
So my area of research in PhD is a comparative study between Nepalese and Tibetan diasporic literature, and I would like to bring this research into a book form. One publishing house has accepted it. So I'm working on this next book, and you know that Nepalese diasporic literature, Tibetan diasporic literature from the Himalayan region have been neglected, and it creates a kind of identity that we call quote unquote an Himalayan identity, which Namita Gokhale has addressed in her book Himalayan Arc. So my plan is to work on this particular area. So looking forward to working on this more.
Looking forward to it and looking forward to you coming back here with your
Thank
next
you,
book. Yeah. Any questions?
First question is, why is China suppressing the Tibetan aspirations? And I read in the newspaper that China has built a nuclear reactor in Tibet. And India gave home to Tibet. What is the difference between the Hindu religion and the Tibetan Buddhist religion? Could you give salient points?
Okay, so coming to your first question, you know that there are many answers because the Chinese ways of representation of Tibet is quite different from India's ways of representing Tibet. Because Chinese look at Tibet as barbaric, uncultured, uncivilized, and if you look at the history of Chinese invasion and occupation of Tibet in 1950s, you will find that how they brutally killed Tibetans, and Dalai Lama with all Tibetans has escaped. They have escaped from Tibet into India. But India's ways of looking is quite different because Buddhism, as you told, the culture, food habit, the dress, all these things have connected India and Tibet. And they understand their situation because India has gone through the phases of colonialism, and they know that. And so from that point of view, you can see the sympathetic attitude of Indian towards Tibet. And what about the next question?
Yeah, I think about Hinduism, Buddhism. It's a huge question, but do you want to take that? About Hinduism and Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism.
Tibetan Buddhism. So this book does not deal with the Tibetan Buddhism, but you know that Tibetan Buddhism plays an important role because if you go to some Western university, you will see that now many courses are available on Tibetan Buddhism. So the way Tibet is looked at and the way Tibet is looked at this at present is quite different because Buddhism, if you go to Nepal, you will find that there are many Tibetan lamas, what is called? Monasteries, Tibetan monasteries are there. So these practices create a kind of connection between India and Tibet. Okay.
This could be a little outside the timeline scope of your book, but how did the region survive during the Chinese era of empires, the Qin dynasties and all of it, without any military defense? Was it just political negotiations that they survived the region? Just curious, I'm sorry.
So this book is mainly written from the literary representation, from the perspective of literary representation. So yes, there are references of some history. So it was very difficult for Tibetans to survive. If you look at the history, Nepal and India provide them shelters. And you know the phrase that Hindi chini bhai bhai. You don't know, okay. So this is the famous phrase that Hindi chini bhai bhai. So there is a huge politics behind this because if you look at the relationship between Nehru and Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So we need to think and rethink about the history because history is something that is very much there in their mind and which they can't forget. But in the literary works, in the novels and the poems and the short stories, you will see some glances of history. But more than that, what they want to concentrate on, that they want their homeland back.
So
that is very crucial.
It's a very complicated history, I'll tell you that much. And we can talk about it outside because I think it's not really here. But Tibet had a history as an independent country. I'll just say that. Yes, he doesn't want to talk.
I was curious about why you picked these particular 3 books and you didn't include anything on contemporary Tibet, like written by present day.
Okay. So no, there is a chapter that is primarily based on Tibetan writings, exilic writings and activism. And the name of the chapter is Reconfiguring Tibetan Activism in Diaspora, and where I have mentioned about the Tibetan contemporary writings, because there are a corpus of a good number of Tibetan diasporic writings. When I started working on this area, there were not much books available. It was 2015.
They're all in English because
Yes.
the language is in
Yes,
danger
some
of
books are
dying
written
out.
in English, because the books which I have been working on, all these are written in English, Tibetan Anglophone literature.
And I've heard and read from different places that the Chinese are relocating the Han people into Tibet to occupy most of Tibet. And the current generation of young Tibetans are not allowed to study in Tibetan language. So they're actually trying to wipe out entirely Tibet as it existed all these years.
Yes, of course. I read an article in newspaper that a Tibetan teacher who was talking about Tibetan language in school or college or university, and he was imprisoned for 5 years. So they are under constant surveillance. Last year I talked to Buchungdi Sonam, who is the founder of Tibet Rise Publishing House, and he told that some Tibetan called in Tibet or tried to contact in Tibet. So he was treated in such a way that you cannot narrate it into words. So yes, they are under constant surveillance and under threat, and they are looking to come out from this brutal torture of Chinese people.
So thank you very much, and we request Ambassador Tirumurthy to please honor our guests. And if you'd like to say a few words to finish the session.
See, these are unexpected honors which is conferred on you to say a few words. I must say it was absolutely fascinating what he is mentioning, particularly comparing how, Tibet is being treated by the West. And I was particularly struck by one fact on the Lost Horizon about how Lost Horizon was not about Tibet, it was about Western dominance, and how, it is a beautiful thing which you have done. I must congratulate you. I must say one thing that, as a youngster, I was liaison officer to the Dalai Lama, and I used to accompany him when he came to Delhi. And like all youngsters, I asked him, who is the greatest Indian you have met? And the Dalai Lama said the greatest Indian he has met is Dr. Rajendra Prasad, because he said that he was the most spiritual Indian he has ever met. But he also added that the most sincere Indian he has met is Jawaharlal Nehru. And he said, do you know why? I said, no. That's because Jawaharlal Nehru used to get angry even with me. So anyway, thank you very much. It was very enlightening.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.